A while ago, we showed off a really cool controller called the ASCII Sphere 360, and those guys, ASCII, have made a ton of really interesting controllers for a whole bunch of consoles. And this controller right here is probably one of their tiniest. It's called the ASCII Stick Super L5, and it's for the Super Famicom, or Super Nintendo, over here. And you gotta check this thing out. A really unique feature with this controller is its sliding faceplate. Right on the front where the D-pad is, you can actually shift the whole thing left and right. And the reason they do that is simply for ergonomics. See, when you're holding this controller with one hand, your thumb and your index finger are the only fingers that are being used to access the buttons on this thing. And the whole reason that you need to shift it left and right is to better suit your needs. If you're playing a certain game that uses certain buttons more than others, you're better shifting it off to the left or right so you have direct access to those buttons.
Now, I personally think this controller looks pretty cool, but after I played it a little bit, well, I ran into some issues. I came across a problem right at the beginning when using this controller that affected every single game I played. See, with the normal Super Nintendo controller, you hold it with both hands, and you have a very tight grip over the controller without holding any of the buttons. But with this controller, no matter how I held it, I was always pushing some face button, which caused a little bit of awkwardness while playing, which you'll probably see throughout all of the gameplay. I wanted to test out a bunch of different games using this one-handed controller on the SNES, so the first game I picked up was Cool Spot. Right away, I found it really difficult to play the game with a one-handed controller because it was just a completely different experience to get used to. I tried out F-Zero to see what a racing game would feel like with this controller, and unfortunately it was really hard to take corners while maintaining a solid grip on the device. So what I ended up doing was putting my thumb over top of the up direction on the D-pad just to keep my hands stable and make sure the controller didn't fall out of my grip. The left and right shoulder buttons on a regular Super Nintendo controller are usually accessible by your index fingers, but with this controller, this kinda didn't work out. See, the shoulder buttons are those tiny little buttons you see on the face there, right beside the D-pad, and this creates a big problem when you want to lean left and right on F-Zero. It's kind of impossible. In fact, I'd say that any game that requires you to push the directional pad while also pushing those L and R buttons, well, they probably can't be played with this controller. So directly after F-Zero, I decided to try out a turn-based RPG. I threw in Final Fantasy VI and the game ran with absolutely no problems whatsoever. Then I played Super Punch-Out, and I was kinda surprised. This game works really well with this controller. Pretty much everything you need to access are on the buttons on the back and the D-pad on the front. You never have to use L and R, and it makes a very easy to play experience. I tried to play Contra, which is nearly impossible to play with this thing unless you're really good with one-handed controllers, and then I tried out Donkey Kong Country 2, which worked really well. I actually didn't have any problems playing this game, but I could see some people that are not used to one-handed controllers kinda getting lost in the mix. If you're not used to one-handed controllers, this controller is gonna be very difficult to use. Over about an hour of gameplay, I found myself getting used to the controller, but still, I wasn't really very comfortable with it. I still prefer a two-handed controller because some games are just really designed for that kind of input.
You can use this controller with pretty much any Super Nintendo game out there, but I wouldn't recommend using it with action games or platformers because those require a lot of really direct inputs that are better suited for gamepads that use both your hands. This controller right here is more or less good for RPGs like Final Fantasy VI or Chrono Trigger, games that don't require fast input right away. And for games that are dating simulators, which is why I imagine they designed this controller because it frees up one hand. Yeah. Kinda gross. There are a lot of advantages to having a one-handed controller. For instance, you could be playing a video game with one hand and eating a sandwich with the other, which is pretty cool. But I think the biggest advantage is for people that are amputees or have had, I don't know, shoulder surgery, like Terence did recently. See, right here, Terence is trying to use the Super Nintendo controller normally, but he can't really use his other hand because, well, he just had surgery. So it's really difficult to put in the button commands that he needs. But now, Terence is using the one-handed controller, and as you can see, he's having a lot more fun. And no, this isn't fake, he actually can't use his other arm. So this is pretty cool that we got this controller around the same time. Even though this controller was designed for RPGs and games like that, I feel like people that only have use of one hand could really get used to using this to play all sorts of games. And I know ever since this thing came out, they started making a lot of one-handed controllers that have really opened up the market for a lot more people to play video games. So, if you're a really big fan of the Super Nintendo and can't use one hand or the other, you gotta try this thing out, because honestly, you might find that it'll make your game playing a lot better.